Okay, I'm ready to join you all. I'm assuming that I can be heard well, and I am very happy to be a part of this webinar and share this information with you all. And I wanted to talk just very briefly about the role of Joint Commission and how we play together, CMS and Joint Commission. Approximately 80% of the hospitals in the United States, including critical access hospitals, are accredited by Joint Commission, but accreditation is voluntary. Every hospital that receives Medicare and Medicaid funding is certified as a participant in Medicare and Medicaid. And if a hospital would choose not to be Joint Commission accredited, they simply would be surveyed by the state agencies. It's a joint effort. Information is shared back and forth between Joint Commission and CMS. And as Karen and Greg talked about earlier, as part of the process of having the deeming authority, which means if you meet their standards, you meet CMS's standards, they have to come in with their standards and apply and be approved by CMS, their entire process. There's surveyors' credentials and credibility, everything involved with their accreditation process has to be pre-approved by CMS, and it's for a period of time. So many of you know there's many different kinds of accreditation processes for home health, hospice, and so forth, and all of that is approved ahead of time by CMS. So I just want to explain that a little bit. So when Joint Commission had their deeming authority written into the statutes, only their hospital program fit into that category. Any other accreditation process they had, they routinely came in for approval and reapproval to CMS. So now the hospital program has just been added to that. And again, before I start into the proposed, the CMS requirements that we are revising and making additions to are longstanding, as Karen indicated. And we believe part of the reason we wanted to push forward on this so quickly is because most people were not aware that the Joint Commission requirements did not match Medicare's, and in good faith set up these networks following the Joint Commission standards, because Joint Commission standards are usually, most of the time, are the higher bar and more closer to the standard of practice, because it takes so long to revise regulations and so forth. So I just needed to fill you in a little bit of information about that, and now I'll talk specifically about the actual proposed regulations. Oh, and I also want to reiterate what Karen talked about. The requirements for the conditions of participation do apply to all patients. The only exception setting is ambulatory surgery centers. So all regulations for all the different provider types, ESRDs, long-term care facilities, all of them, the regulations apply to all patients regardless of payer source. I just thought I'd throw that information in. Next slide is the learning objectives, and I just hope that you have a clear understanding of what we were trying to do with the proposed rule, and that it's clear to you that we are looking for comments and welcome them. They're not a burden to us. They're time-consuming to address, but we really appreciate them because it helps us to hear exactly what you all out in the field have to say. Next slide, Greg. Okay, you will see throughout this presentation at least 2 or 3 different references to the comments about making comments. You can access this rule online at the Federal Register. You can just type in Federal Register, and you can download the rule on the PDF file. And of course, I believe you can get access to this link, which would take you right to the PDF file. As you will see a couple of places in the presentation, the comment period closes after July 26th. There are several ways to comment. You can submit written comments, you can send e-comments and so forth, but any comment that comes in, whether it's written or it's an e-comment or whatever, will be available to be viewed online. All written comments are scanned in. We are required by law, by the Administrative Procedures Act, to respond to all comments in the final rule. But you may see if we get, say, 20 comments on the same issue, then we would summarize those comments and respond with one response. The final rule can be revised based on the comments that we receive. So I want to make sure you all understood that, to be very clear and articulate in the recommendations you might have for us. Additionally, When the final rule goes back to the clearance process, all of the HHS agencies and also the Office of Management and Budget get an opportunity to comment on the final rule based on their understanding of the issue. So there's an opportunity for a lot of feedback from a lot of different people prior to this final rule being published. We hope to publish the final rule very quickly, much faster than our normal process, which it usually takes us 2 to 3 years, and we are mandated by law to have a final rule out after proposed within 3 years. But that's the normal process, mainly because of the opportunity for so many people to comment within the government in Texas. Next slide. You will see that we did recognize that the current requirements were often duplicative for hospitals engaged in telemedicine services and particularly burdensome for the smaller hospitals. But as well as the burden associated with the project, it also became clear to us that this would be cost prohibitive to implement. As Karen indicated, the network systems in the smaller hospitals just simply would not have been able to afford to implement the regulations as they were required at that time. So we recognized how urgent it was to change the conditions of participation so that the access to these vital services, which we believe are very vital, could continue in a manner that's both safe and beneficial to the patient. Now, as I talk about these requirements, I wanted to also be clear to everyone because it is confusing at times. As I talk, I will say COPs, I will say conditions of participation, I'll say provisions, I'll say requirements, I'll say regulations. They all mean the same thing. It just depends on how it fits in a sentence or whatever, and I did not want that to confuse anyone. So any reference I make to the regulations or provisions or requirements, I'm talking about the conditions of participation requirements. The next slide. The current requirements that include the medical staff review credentialing and privileging info and make recommendations to the governing body has not been changed. These requirements that we are going to talk about, the proposed, are new additions that tie into the other requirements that already exist. So the corresponding changes were needed in 2 of the current hospital conditions of participation, in the governing body and in the medical staff. We'll talk about that a little bit. Next slide. The governing body COP requires that the governing body makes a decision about assigning people to the medical staff based on the recommendation from their medical staff. So what that means is the medical staff at any hospital reviews all the credentialing and privileging files and makes a recommendation to the governing body, and then the governing body grants the privileges. So all physicians and practitioners available to provide telemedicine services have been vetted through the process prior to providing telemedicine services. Now, what does this mean? In the agreement that we are proposing between, in what we call the distant hospital, which is the hospital that is providing the telemedicine service, and the smaller facility, which is receiving the service, in that agreement, we are expecting to see that the larger facility or the distant site ensures, in verbiage in that agreement, that they are meeting all of the current requirements related to the medical staff reviewing and making recommendations to the governing body, and then the governing body granting those privileges. I hope that's clear to everyone. So the current requirements is the medical staff reviews and then makes recommendations to the governing body, and the governing body then approves the privileges stand. Through the agreement, the hospital that is providing the telemedicine service is telling the smaller hospital, all of our physicians that are providing telemedicine services have been vetted through this process. We are ensuring you they are qualified and privileged to provide the services they're going to provide to you. Okay, next slide. We left the option open that the hospitals have the option to do the credentialing and privileging and approving of privileges through this process. They do not have to. So hospitals can continue to use the usual process, which is they review all the credentials and privileging information and make recommendations based on their own personal review. Let me see if I can see where I wanted to talk about the list. This is on the next, no, it's on the next slide, and I'll talk to you about the information that comes in the medical staff COP. So we just want to make sure that we let the option open that they do not have to use this process when they are credentialing and privileging telemedicine service providers. Okay, the next slide. Okay, the hospital medical staff will be allowed to rely on the information for its privileging recommendations to the governing body only if certain provisions are met. First of all, the other hospital, the distance site hospital that is providing the telemedicine service must be a Medicare participating hospital. There are very, very few hospitals that are not Medicare participating. But we wanted to make sure that that was very clear. Also, the physicians that are providing the telemedicine services must be privileged at the distance site hospital that's providing the service. Also, the state the telemedicine provider, practitioner or provider from the distance site hospital must have a license in the state where the patient is. Okay, the hospital receiving the telemedicine services is responsible also for sending any adverse events or complaints concerning these practitioners related to the telemedicine service to the distance site hospital for inclusion in their review process. So in the agreement, a lot of these different elements need to be articulated. And as we all know, physicians and other practitioners are credentialed and reappraised and recredentialed every couple of years. It's important that the smaller facility or the car, whatever, that's receiving the telemedicine services reports back to the larger facility or the distance site so that the information they have can be included in that reappraisal and peer review process that the larger facility is doing on the practitioners that are providing telemedicine services. This actual change in the medical staff COPs is in the bylaws section, and it refers back to the requirements that are within the governing body COP. So it's two changes in the hospital COPs that ties it both together. Okay, the next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about the critical access hospital changes. As you know, the critical access hospital requirements are different from the regular hospital requirements. They were originally adapted from rural health clinics and hospitals back in the early 90s. So that's why there's a huge focus on the outpatient setting. So I throw that in. Again, in these conditions of participation, we also added requirements, most of which mirror what we proposed in the hospital COPs and what already exists in the hospital regulations. What I mean by that is we took some language out of the hospital conditions of participation and inserted them into current language, inserted them into the critical access hospital regulations, in addition to telemedicine requirements, because it didn't exist in the critical access hospital regulation. And for this to all tie together and be as closely matched as possible, we adopted some of the hospital requirements and dumped them into the critical access hospital piece. Okay, next slide. In the critical access hospital requirements, we needed to propose language in two sections of the conditions of participation, under the agreement section and the periodic evaluation and performance review. The next slide. Again, the requirements for calls are similar to those proposed for hospitals, but they're designed to make the critical access hospital or credentialing and privileging requirements more consistent with the current and proposed hospital requirements. I want to make sure everyone understood why we added the verbiage that we added to the critical access hospital piece. And specifically in regard to state laws, the next slide, so you got it, thank you. State laws and which categories of practitioners can be appointed to the medical staff, the appointment of medical staff based on recommendations by the current members, the bylaws, the approval of those bylaws, accountability of medical staff to the governing body for the quality of care provided to all patients, and the criteria for selection. The next slide. And similar to the proposed changes to the hospital COPs, the proposed requirements and costs would also ensure that there's an agreement, the exact same requirements, that it specifies the responsibility of the critical access hospital governing body, ensuring that this site is furnishing the services meets the same requirements in relation to the credentialing and privileging of those physicians and practitioners.